welcome back. The last time we read our story, we learned about a taxing time, the Boston Tea Party, right? Today, we are going to learn about the shot heard around the world. But before we can talk about that, we're going to have to talk a little bit more about what we have already learned. So, let's review. What happened in our previous read aloud? Yeah, taxes, the Boston Tea Party, the First Continental Congress. So when we were talking about the taxes, why did the king and the British Parliament start taxing the colonies on their goods that they purchased, such as tea? They wanted to make extra money because it had cost them a lot of money to set up and protect the colonies, remember? Were the British colonists happy about these taxes? Why or why not? No, they were so angry because they felt that it was unfair to be taxed since they didn't have any representatives in the British Parliament to help them decide how much tax should be or even what to spend the taxes on. They're like, that's not fair. All right, for the Boston Tea Party, what did the colonists do in response to the king's taxes, and what did they call that event? The colonists dumped all the British tea into the Boston Harbor, and that event was called the Boston Tea Party. All right. What did the King of Great Britain do in response to the Boston Tea Party? Yeah, he closed those ports so that no supplies could get in or out of Boston. Oopsie. All right, so First Continental Congress. What was the First Continental Congress? It was the meeting where the representatives from the colonies who got together, it was a meeting of the representatives from the colonies who got together to discuss or talk about what happened and what to do about Great Britain. And it happened after the Boston Tea Party and after the king had cut off the ports, right? What were the colonists who wanted to remain loyal to the king called? What were they called? That's right, they were called the Loyalists. Excuse me. And what were the colonists who wanted to rule themselves called? Yeah, the Patriots. All right, so we're going to continue learning about some of the important events that led to the creation of our nation, the United States of America. And I want you to listen carefully to find out what happened to lead to the shot heard around the world. Okay? Okay. After the Boston Tea Party, King George sent thousands of British soldiers to Boston to make sure the colonists obeyed the king's orders, or to make sure that they were going to do what the king ordered them to do, okay? They swarmed the streets of the city in their fancy red uniforms with shiny buttons, earning themselves the name Redcoats. They carried weapons with them everywhere they went. This made the people of Boston very angry. The city no longer felt like home to them. They did not know whom to trust. Spies, or people who secretly kept watch on other people to try and figure out what they were up to, were spread out all over the city. British soldiers disguised as colonists, and colonists disguised as British soldiers. There was a lot of whispering in the streets as people kept secrets from one another. It was not a very pleasant time, and it was even a little scary. Paul Revere was a silversmith living in Boston. Remember, we saw a picture of Paul Revere's shop in the last story. As a silversmith, he was kept quite busy making and repairing silver dinnerware, candlesticks, and jewelry. A sign with a silver pitcher hung outside of his shop on the town square. In those days, it was common for shopkeepers to hang signs above their doors with pictures of what could be bought inside their shops. Do you remember the picture of the Boston shop you saw in the previous read aloud? That was a picture of Paul Revere's silversmith shop. I can actually probably go back to that. Aha, here it is. That's Paul Revere's silversmith shop. Okay. One day, the door to his shop flew open and a friend rushed over to Revere's side. The two men were both members of the Sons of Liberty, the group of patriots who had emptied the tea into Boston's harbor. Ever since the Boston Tea Party, the colonists of Massachusetts had been hiding weapons, gunpowder, and cannonballs in neighboring towns. The British, afraid the colonists might be planning to attack them, captured the weapons whenever they learned where they were hidden. Why do you think the colonists might have started hiding these materials? So that the British don't take them? It's a possibility. Now, as the two men huddled together in the back of Revere's shop, his friend whispered that the British were planning to raid the colonists' storehouse of weapons in the town of Concord. The British were to travel that night, he said, but nobody knew whether they would march there by land or choose a shorter route and sail on a boat by the sea. The Patriots knew they must somehow warn the militia in Concord that the British were coming by sea. A militia is an army of ordinary people, so they're just normal people like you and me, so they're not trained to fight, okay? Revere and others spied on or secretly watched over the British colony to discover the soldiers' plans. When Revere learned the troops were coming by sea, he arranged for a signal to be given, a secret code. His friend was to climb up the bell tower of the Old North Church, light one lantern, and hang it in the belfry or bell tower if the British are traveling by land. But if they are traveling by boat, by sea, hang two lanterns. So, Paul Revere told his friend that if they are going to go by foot, he's going to hang one lantern. If they are traveling by boat, hang two lanterns. Paul Revere left his family and crept down to the banks of the Charles River. He quietly crossed the river in a boat to a spot where he had borrowed a horse from his friend and fellow patriot. Paul Revere mounted the horse, tipped his hat in thanks to the patriots, and sped away. Do you guys see? What do you think? Are the British going by land or by boat? Look up here. There are two lanterns. What does two lanterns mean? By sea. Yep. As he galloped through towns along the way, Revere shouted to the colonists in their beds, "The redcoats are coming! The redcoats are coming!" All around him, shutters were thrown open as people began walking in the middle of the night. When Revere reached the town of Lexington with word of the approaching British troops, men hurried from their homes, joining one another with their muskets in the middle of the town. These men, known as Minutemen, because they were expected to be ready to fight in a minute's notice, slept with their muskets and gunpowder beside their beds. Revere was joined by a second rider, William Dawes, who had been sent on the same mission but following a different path to Lexington. At dawn, the British reached Lexington. The Minutemen were farmers and shopkeepers, volunteers for their country, not trained soldiers. So a volunteer is somebody who chooses to do a job without being paid, okay? They looked ragged next to the well-dressed British soldiers or redcoats. In the confusion of the early morning hours, a shot was fired. Others fired back, and fighting continued throughout the morning. Finally, Minutemen were able to find... Sorry, the cat just stepped on the book. I can't see where I'm reading. Ow! Now she bit me. Finally, Minutemen were able to force the British to return to Boston, firing at them from behind rocks, trees, and fences all along the way. To this day, no one knows who fired the first shot that day. Nerves had been on edge since the Boston Tea Party, so it's not surprising that guns went off. That first shot was the beginning of a long war between the British and their American colonies. It is known as the shot heard around the world because not only did it change the life in the colonies, but it also changed things around the world in Great Britain all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. Okay. So, the people in Great Britain couldn't actually hear the shot, guys. It's just a famous saying that simply means that that shot had a big effect on Great Britain and the rest of the world, okay? That long war became known as the Revolutionary War. Could it be that the shot heard round the world rang so loudly from Massachusetts colony that it actually reached King George's ears in April? What do you think? No, I just told you. All right, it is question time. So, what was the main topic of this read aloud? What was the big thing that we talked about? Paul Revere helped the Minutemen get prepared to fight the British, and the Revolutionary War started with the battle at Lexington. Who were the Redcoats? The British Army. Who were the Minutemen? The colonial militia, meaning the people of the colonies. And the militia just means it's an army of people who are not trained to fight. They're just people like you and me. Why do you think Paul Revere warned colonists that the Redcoats were coming? Because he was a patriot. He was trying to help his side win, help his side get a little bit of a head start. What does the well-known phrase of 1 if by land, 2 if by sea mean? Think about those lanterns. And I'll say the phrase again. 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. That's right. Okay? It refers to the signal that the colonists, or the patriots, were giving. So they were told 1 lantern meant that the Redcoats were coming by land, and 2 meant that they were coming by sea or by boat. Okay? What was the shot heard around the world? It was the beginning of the fighting between the Redcoats and the Minutemen at Lexington that started the Revolutionary War. Do you think there would have been a shot heard around the world if the Sons of Liberty had not been prepared? So if the colonists were not prepared, if they didn't know that the Redcoats were coming, do you think that there would have been a shot heard around the world? Maybe, maybe not. We don't really know, do we? It's time for some word work. Oops, not that. In my read aloud, you heard me say, the Minutemen were farmers and shopkeepers, volunteers for their country, not trained soldiers. I want you to say the word volunteers with me. Say it as a mouse, a whisper, monster, grandpa, however you want. Volunteer. 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 Volunteers are people who do something without being paid or told to do something. There are many volunteers at a fire station, so some firemen are volunteer firemen. Have I ever asked for volunteers in the classroom? Yes, if you're in my class, you know that I ask for volunteers all the time, right? A volunteer to run an errand for me, maybe to run a message to one of the other teachers in first grade, or maybe even to kindergarten. Can you think of some other places where volunteers might help out? I want you to try to use the word volunteer when you are telling about it. Go ahead. What's that word we've been talking about? Volunteers. And volunteers are people who do something without being paid or told to do something. They just do it. I'm going to describe a situation, and if it describes people helping out without being paid or told to do something, you're going to say they are volunteers. If it does not, you will say they are not volunteers. Tony and John were paid $10 to rake the leaves in their neighbor's yard. They are not volunteers. Lisa and Pablo offered to pick up the litter on the playground. They are volunteers. The teacher was amazed that 10 students asked if they could help clean up the art supplies. They are volunteers. Maria and Hannah were paid $5 to babysit their little brother. They are not volunteers. Jeff and Layla asked if they could take their grandparents' dog for a walk. They are volunteers, right? So a volunteer is somebody who does something without being paid or told to do something. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed and you learned some new stuff. Talk to you soon. Bye.